Have you ever noticed how certain days seem to drag on inside as if something within you is trying to slow down the entire world without your permission? There are times when your body feels heavier than it should, but the real weight isn't in your muscles, it's in the place where your thoughts hide when they don't want to be seen. And perhaps that's why this strange exhaustion doesn't respond to coffee, rest, or willpower, because it wasn't born from ordinary tiredness, but from something older, more intimate, deeper. Jung would say that when the soul tries to speak and you don't listen, it finds other ways to make itself known. But what if this lack of energy that you insist on calling laziness isn't a flaw but a warning? What if what you're trying to ignore is precisely what's moving everything in the opposite direction? There are signals that the psyche sends that aren't shouted, they're whispered, and that's why many people go through life without noticing them. Have you ever imagined how many times your own mind has tried to protect you from yourself? Exhaustion in this case wouldn't be a problem, it would be a coded message. Perhaps you've noticed that the more you try to react, the more your body refuses. It's not frustration, it's symbolic resistance. Jung saw this as the exact point at which consciousness becomes incapable of sustaining an internal lie. The collapse isn't physical, it's psychological. It's as if a forgotten part of you is tired of carrying stories that never belong to you and begins, little by little, to withdraw the energy that kept those narratives afloat. And when that happens, the truth doesn't appear, it demands to be found. The thing is, nobody told you there's an invisible limit to how much you can tolerate that doesn't make sense. And when you cross that line, the body ceases to be obedient and transforms into denunciation. Jung called this a symbolic rupture, an internal movement that attempts to undo what you've built, just to survive. That's why this feeling doesn't go away. That's why nothing excites you. That's why you feel trapped in something you can't name. The psyche draws energy from everything that isn't authentic. And now, faced with this strange state between alertness and immobility, one question remains that you may never have asked yourself. What exactly is your soul trying to stop you from doing? Because it's not tiredness, it's not laziness, it's not weakness. It's a signal, one that Jung would recognize immediately and that you will only truly understand when you listen to what comes next. There's a moment, almost imperceptible, when the soul begins to give up on sustaining what never made sense. And it is precisely at that moment that the body falters. Not because it is weak, but because it is exhausted from carrying narratives that you swore you needed to keep alive. The lack of energy appears as a thin shadow, impossible to grasp, but capable of enveloping everything, and you try to fight it as if it were an external enemy. However, the more you fight, the more it settles in. Jung said that the psyche draws strength from what no longer serves. Like someone slowly turning off the light in a room where you insist on remaining even after realizing that the air inside is no longer breathable. And perhaps that's why this silent weariness accompanies you in the most unlikely moments, like an old question you tried to bury but that always finds a crack to return. There are days when getting up seems impossible, not because of physical incapacity, but because something inside you gently presses you to stop, look, and realize what you're trying to sustain without having the internal resources to do so. The body warns before the mind admits it, and the mind retreats before the soul accepts it, creating this confusing territory where nothing matches what you feel it should be. And it is in this misalignment that the signs emerge. Have you ever noticed how exhaustion increases precisely when you try to force continuity? As if each step taken against your own essence drains the energy that should keep you standing? The psyche acts like an intelligent organism that tries to reorganize its fragments even when you try to go in the opposite direction. Jung understood this as a kind of necessary sabotage, not to destroy you, but to interrupt the repetition of something that was never truly yours. And when life insists on continuing while you collapse inside, this exhaustion becomes the language you haven't learned to translate. There's also the strange feeling that something internal is about to break. But it's not about losing control, it's about revelation. As if the deepest part of you is tired of passively observing the distance between who you appear to be and who you really are. This fatigue doesn't ask for rest, it asks for reinterpretation. It doesn't want pauses, it wants awareness. And before the rational mind tries to contain it with logical explanations, the body gets ahead and drains the energy needed to sustain the old, involuntarily opening a space so that the new can be revealed. It's not weakness, it's a psychological signal. And then comes the most disconcerting moment, the one in which you realize that nothing external explains what is happening. It's not work, it's not routine, it's not pressure. It's something subterranean, ancestral, intimate, something you've been ignoring because you thought you could control it. But the psyche doesn't play in the field of control, it plays in the field of truth. And when it decides to speak, it doesn't ask your permission. This weariness is the beginning of a process you don't yet understand. but which has already begun to lead you in a direction from which you cannot escape simply by returning to acting as before. There is a hidden calling pulsing in the subtext of your own resistance. There comes a point when you start to feel that life has become too heavy to bear, yet simultaneously too light to justify the weight you feel. It's a disturbing paradox, as if something inside you is trying to dismantle each piece that sustains your daily life, not to destroy it but to reorganize it. Jung observed that when psychic energy withdraws, it's not punishing you, it's guiding you. The exhaustion you feel is proof that parts of you are trying to move, even if everything else seems paralyzed. It's a silent, almost imperceptible movement, but profound enough to reconfigure everything you believe to be immutable. And isn't it curious how this lack of energy arises precisely when you try to meet expectations that weren't created by you? As if every time you try to fulfill a role that doesn't belong to you, your psyche closes an internal door, preventing access to the necessary strength to sustain it. It's as if your truest self is watching you from a distance, and tired of seeing you insist on what drains you, slowly shuts down the energy source so that you are forced to look at what you avoid. This withdrawal is not random, it's a form of emotional survival. Have you ever noticed that this profound tiredness forces you to slow down? It's not just a physical sensation, it's a summons. An internal structure is shifting, demanding that you stop fulfilling cycles that repeat themselves out of habit, not choice. Jung explained that the unconscious sends increasingly strong signals when you stray too far from what you should be experiencing. Exhaustion is the echo of this detachment. It's the body saying it can no longer sustain a life that doesn't align with its truth. And it is at this point that the confusion increases, because you try to react as you always have, try to follow the same routines. Try to motivate yourself with the same arguments, but nothing works, nothing fits, nothing responds. As if the universe itself were conspiring to prevent you from continuing to move in the wrong direction. It's not external sabotage, it's internal reorganization. When the soul decides to change direction, life around you becomes uncomfortable, forcing you to realize that the path no longer makes sense. And there's a detail that few dare to admit. Extreme exhaustion often appears precisely when you're about to confront a truth you've avoided for too long. It's as if the psyche is preparing the ground, shattering illusions, neutralizing distractions, removing everything that keeps you away from the inevitable encounter with yourself. This emptiness you feel isn't absence, it's space being created. A space that, sooner or later, will need to be filled with the truth you've been postponing. There comes a point when the absence of energy ceases to be merely a nuisance and becomes a mirror that reveals fissures you've tried to cover up for years, as if life could continue functioning even with broken internal parts. But the psyche doesn't accept eternal patches, it demands truth, and when it realizes you're masking what needs to be faced, it begins to close the paths through which your vitality flowed. Not to paralyze you, but to prevent you from continuing to sustain versions of yourself created to please, survive, or endure. It's an exhaustion that asks without words, how long will you keep running from yourself? And it's impossible not to notice how this state creates a kind of inner silence, a space in which old voices lose strength and others, still unknown, begin to approach. Jung described this as the approach of repressed contents seeking to manifest themselves so that consciousness can expand. You feel this as a diffuse discomfort, a restlessness that has no name, but that pulsates as if it wants to emerge. It is life asking to be reorganized from within, dismantling emotional structures that can no longer bear the weight of repetitions. Perhaps that's why small things start to affect you more than they should. It's not exaggerated sensitivity, it's perception. The sensitivity you try to control is the same sensitivity that tries to alert you to everything that has been neglected for so long. It doesn't weaken, it reveals. And the moment you try to stifle it, the energy withdraws even faster, as if saying, until you look at this, I won't let you move on. This deep weariness is less an enemy and more a guardian, protecting what still needs to be understood. It's also common that in this state, you begin to feel a strange mix of urgency and immobility, as if one part of you knows exactly where you should go while another refuses to take any step. This internal conflict consumes energy brutally. Jung saw this as a psychic battle between the old and the new, between the persona you've learned to display and the self that's trying to emerge. Exhaustion arises precisely from the effort to keep alive an identity that is already dying inside. And when that realization finally begins to take hold, you feel a subtle shift, a sense that something bigger is about to be revealed. It's not something external, it's not a ready-made answer, it's not an easy solution. It's an understanding that approaches slowly, almost like a shadow growing on the wall before you see its full form. The psyche is preparing the moment of revelation, removing excesses, dismantling illusions, making room for what you always knew but never had the courage to fully admit. Some phases of life begin with a strange realization. Everything continues happening around you, but inside you feel as if you're watching your own routine from afar. Nothing seems exactly wrong, but nothing fits together as it once did. This feeling isn't disorientation. It's the psyche reorganizing what you tried to keep still. Describe these moments as transition points, when the unconscious takes over because consciousness insists on ignoring what needs to be seen. Profound exhaustion arises as a consequence of this silent struggle. On certain days, even small efforts consume more than they should, and the mind seems to operate as if carrying an invisible emotional weight. This fatigue doesn't respond to physical rest because it didn't originate in the body. It arises from the attempt to sustain an identity that no longer aligns with its internal processes. The psyche, noticing this imbalance, withdraws energy from superficial functions to return it to the parts that require repair. And even if this seems like defeat, it is actually a necessary realignment. As this process progresses, old beliefs begin to lose consistency. What once seemed definitive now dissolves with unexpected ease. It's not indecision, it's clarity arriving subtly. Jung observed that when psychic energy moves, it breaks down structures that no longer serve the purpose of individuation. Fatigue emerges as a mark of this internal breakdown, as if the soul were asking you to stop sustaining what hinders your own growth. Over time, you realize that you try to react to old stimuli, but nothing provokes the same. Impulses before what guided you stops working. What moved you loses strength. This change is usually distressing because you feel you've lost something when in fact you're just making room for something new. The psyche, according to Jung, doesn't allow you to continue feeding patterns that hinder your expansion. Therefore, it withdraws energy from repetitions and only returns it when you move closer to the right direction. And then an unexpected sensation arises, an emptiness that doesn't frighten but intrigues. An inner space that seems to await something you don't yet know how to name. This emptiness doesn't represent absence, it represents preparation. The energy that disappears from the surface accumulates at the bottom, awaiting the moment to emerge as a new force. Jung saw this period as a crucial stage, the silent interval before complete reorganization. You are at that exact point, the point where the psyche descends into the depths to rebuild everything from within. Often, what you feel as utter exhaustion is actually the beginning of an internal revolution so profound that no words seem capable of fully translating it. The mind begins to rearrange old spaces, displacing emotions you've kept dormant, dismantling beliefs that have sustained entire chapters of your life. This movement generates a kind of psychological stretching, as if something were expanding from the center, asking you to abandon what no longer corresponds to your essence. Jung saw this process as a call from the self, demanding reconciliation between what you show and what you truly are. As this transformation unfolds, you find yourself caught between two impulses: the desire to remain where everything is familiar and the vital need to move towards the unknown that is finally beginning to reveal itself. This conflict drains your strength because it demands that you leave behind certainties that have always served as fragile foundations. Exhaustion appears as a bridge, not an obstacle, and leads you, even against your will, to a territory where masks would not survive. It is a silent but profoundly necessary crossing. You soon realize that the discomfort increases precisely when you try to return to old patterns. Everything that kept you busy, numb, or distracted loses its effectiveness, as if it had ceased to belong to you. The psyche no longer tolerates what distances you from your own center, and therefore withdraws the energy that sustained these repetitions. It is at this exact moment that you feel powerless, when in reality you are being reoriented. Jung said that the unconscious creates ruptures when consciousness refuses to see the right path. This process may seem chaotic, but there is a deep logic behind every sensation you experience. The lack of energy, the sudden disinterest, the difficulty in acting, the desire for withdrawal, all of this points to a state of emotional incubation. You are being prepared to access inner layers that have always been ignored by the need to survive in the external world. And while this happens, your energy is not lost, it recalibrates, it seeks the right place to be reborn. When you finally begin to feel that something is changing, even without being able to explain what, a new kind of strength begins to form. It's not intense, it's not fast, it's not explosive. It's subtle, continuous, intimate. It comes from within, as if a flame were being slowly rekindled in the place where before there was only weariness. Jung described this moment as the return of energy to the central axis, the point where the soul recovers its own direction. It is the beginning of a reorganization that cannot be interrupted because it has already become inevitable. When you reach this point in the journey, something within you begins to recognize that the weariness you carried was not an obstacle but a sign. The lack of energy ceased to be a threat and transformed into language, allowing you to see the silent movement occurring behind each sensation, each resistance, each internal rupture. There is no definitive closure here, only a passage, like someone crossing a door that has always existed, but only now has found the courage to open. It is at this moment that the psyche stops whispering and becomes present, leading you to realize that what seemed like fragility was, in fact, preparation. A preparation to return to your own axis with a clarity that no rational explanation could offer. And when that understanding settles in even gently, everything takes on a different texture. The signs that once seemed confusing now form an internal constellation, bringing together the fragments you tried to ignore throughout your life. It's as if the unconscious, after so much insistence, finally finds space to breathe within you, reorganizing what was broken, illuminating what was dormant. The exhaustion that brought you here reveals itself as a calling, not as punishment. And upon realizing this, you begin to feel the weight lessen, not because it has disappeared, but because you are no longer carrying it alone. The truth spreads, the soul moves, consciousness follows, and everything aligns in the exact measure that you allow. It is in this state between revelation and return that an invitation naturally forms, not as a request, but as a continuation. If something within you has awakened, even minimally, allow that awakening to spread. Share in the comments the passage that resonated most, because your words may be the mirror that someone else doesn't yet possess. Like this video if it touched something you don't usually express. Share it with someone who might be hiding the same silent weariness. And subscribe, not only to follow new content, but to remain in a space where your psyche can breathe without masks. Because in the end, true transformation begins the moment you decide not to return to what has sickened your soul and continue walking towards what finally makes sense.